In this section of Coates, he begins by going through some of the influences of his writing. He talks about poets, classes he took, how they influenced his own thoughts about what it meant for himself to be black. He refers to these realizations of certain contradictions as being painful and exhausting to him. And I kind of relate to this after studying white supremacy last week, because the more I read about it and the more I realized all the contradictions I had about being white myself, I was pretty exhausted, and it was pretty painful to me too, because I began to feel guilty about it in a certain sense. Coates then goes on to talk about how different people influenced his thinking, and these three people were girls that he met. The first was a girl that had black skin color, but he described her as being of lineage of other worlds and has seen other worlds in the vessel of her black body. I thought that this section was particularly interesting because he was realizing that being black meant something completely different than just the color of your skin. This girl appeared black, but she had the culture of Indian descent. The same could be true for someone that appears white. On my missions trip, I met a doctor that appeared completely white. He even had kind of an accent that made him seem European. But the more I found out about him and his culture, he was 100% Peruvian and had lived in Peru his entire life. He was only white by the color of his skin. So I even made that assumption about him in the same way that Coates did about the girl that was black but really was Indian. And then Coates goes on to talk about a girl with long dreadlocks, is what he refers to her as. He mentions how knowing her changed his view on things as well. He mentioned that because of her, his tribe was shattering and reforming around him. The girl lived with people that were way outside of his moral code, and he mentioned sitting in their living room listening to their inside jokes. Part of him was judging them while listening, and part of him was reeling from the changes in what he thought about them. He says that she taught him to love in new ways by being around these people. I completely relate to this story because on my mission trip, again, I had an extremely similar experience. I didn't know anybody going into my mission trip, and everybody there wasn't from Dordt or my church. They were from a public university, University of Missouri. I was sitting in a hotel room surrounded by someone that was gay, someone who had slept with a ton of people, someone who had a similar background as I did, and then also a really smart doctor from a completely different country. We all came from different backgrounds and political spectrums, and as I sat there listening to their conversation, I felt exactly how Coates described, partially judging them and partially reeling about all the changes in my thoughts about them and their backgrounds. They also taught me to love in different ways, not because I now agree with all their ideas, but because I now understand who they are a little bit better and why they have the ideas that they have. Coates then ends this section by talking of the third girl, who is the mom of the son that he's writing this book to. In this section, I also found really interesting because he talked about the mom of his son as the Chicago girl who has a non-existent father, and then he makes a comment about how that's the same as the majority of his friends. He also goes on to speak to his son, saying that he can never forget about the oppression and slavery that black people went through. And his son also has to be responsible for his body in other ways that other boys cannot know. I thought that there was definitely some truth in this section, especially whenever he says, you must be responsible for the worst actions of other black bodies, which will most always be assigned to you. I think that that's definitely true. People automatically associate the worst actions of black people with all other black people. But I wonder if Coates is telling his son to never forget about what happened to him as a way to say, you always have to have a chip on your shoulder, you always have to be mad about this, or if he's saying, you can never forget what other people went through, so you have to appreciate what you have, and you have to remember so that their suffering didn't happen in vain. Because I think that if it's approached in a you have to constantly have a chip on your shoulder, constantly be mad about it type approach, that won't solve any issues. But I don't think that's necessarily what Coates is meaning when he writes this to his son. I think that it's the other way, that he needs to always remember what happened to him so that he never forgets what happened to the people of his past. But I think that a lot of times people that would read this book would definitely take it as you need to have a chip on your shoulder, we were treated so horrible type thing. So I think it'll be interesting to see how some readers of it and his son even took that advice coming from Coates.